conspiracy theory.
Yes, ma'am. Not directly, no, ma'am.
We're ease up on debunking disinformation.
I certainly never interpreted any statements or anything along those lines, no, ma'am.
Well, I would like to explore with you further, perhaps after this panel, some of what you just said in terms of your staff, but I want to move on to a couple of other things just in the interest of time. Director Krebs, given your experience with tackling disinformation, I want to talk about the post-election disinformation campaign that has been waged. The president and many others have tweeted outlandish claims of massive voter fraud and truly wild conspiracy theories. However, the president's lawyers won't or don't usually bring these same claims when they go into court. When they do, the judges, often conservative or Republican appointed judges, have dismissed them. Director Krebs, given your experience with disinformation campaigns, why do you think there is such a gulf between rhetoric and reality? What's the goal of this disinformation campaign?
I think generally that disinformation now, currently, particularly domestically, is being used to create confusion and drive a certain narrative. But our point with rumor control at CISA was about identifying, initially foreign activities, but it became more of a domestic or even uncertain origin. And it was things, again, like Hammer scorecard, some of these claims of malicious algorithms, and they were pretty straightforward to debunk in the early days, but they continue to this day. There's confusion being sown about how election machines are used, how they fit into the process. Even now in Michigan right now with Antrim County, there was a forensics audit done on some of the machines there, and there was a group that released a report. And it's a 22-page report. I looked at it, and others have looked at it. And to me, it implies that those systems are compromised and not dependable, and you can't trust the votes and any other of the machines across the state. So I was a little concerned about that. And I looked at the report, and it claims that there was a 60% error rate in the machines, the election management systems. And so, again, I dug into that, and it makes the claim that then, 68% of the votes cast are therefore not dependable. And I've seen those claims being repeated on social media by the campaign, by the president. And so I wanted to understand what that was all about. So I looked at it, and in fact, it was not that there were 68% of the votes there were errors. It was that the election management system's logs had recorded 68% of some sort of the logs themselves had some sort of alert rate. And that is being used to spin that machine is not trustworthy. But the problem is the report itself doesn't actually specify any of those errors, except for one. And it's on page 19, or actually it's on page 20. And it says, there is no permission to bracket zero bracket. And that is being claimed to mean that somebody tried to get in the machine and wipe the records. And so I looked at that and I said, okay, I don't know if it actually says that. And something jumped out at me, having worked at Microsoft, that these are Windows-based machines. The election management system is a Windows-based machine, and the election management system is coded with a programming language called C#. There is no permission to bracket zero bracket is a placeholder for a parameter. So it may be that it's just not good coding, but that certainly doesn't mean that somebody tried to get in there and zero. They misinterpreted the language in what they saw in their forensic audit. And that's just one example. They misinterpret, and Commissioner Palmer, I'm sure, can talk to us about whether there's a HAVA 90-day safe harbor rule, or which of the VVSGs is applicable to those machines, and whether that machine. So I'm seeing these reports that are factually inaccurate continue to be promoted. That's what rumor control is all about. That's what I'm continuing to do today, based on my experience and understanding and how these systems work. We have to stop this. It's undermining confidence in democracy.
Well, I thank you so much for that statement. Mr. Chair, I'll note that a couple of other people have gone a little bit over their time, And I have one more question for Mr. Krebs.
Sure,
and
go
with
ahead.
your indulgence, I'd like to ask it.
Sure.
Director Krebs, I thank you for that response. I think it's a very important example of the kind of disinformation and spinning that is happening that frankly puts confidence at risk and puts some of our people at risk. You have noted in the past that we have a very diffuse election system that is administered at the local level. At individual polling locations, there are often numerous nonpartisan officials involved in administering a community's voting process. That diffusion of responsibility also makes it extremely unlikely that there would be a single point of failure or fraud that could sway an election. Director Krebs, you have worked with the numerous election officials across state and local governments. Can you speak to how the diffuse nature of our election systems affects the security of our elections? And just also in the interest of time, I want you to comment too. Sadly, some of these nonpartisan officials at the local level have been subjected to harassment and even death threats. So can you speak to the impact of these threats? And do you think the president and his allies have done enough to condemn the threats of violence?
I'm not aware of much in terms of condemning the threats of violence, having been a recipient of some of them. I think it's, again, an affront to democracy that the citizens of the United States of America that are responsible for executing this sacred democratic institution of elections are being threatened on a daily basis. I mean, you name it, whether it's emails, whether it's phone calls, whether it's people showing up at your house. This is not America I recognize, and it's got to stop. We need everyone across the leadership ranks to stand up. I think I would appreciate more support from my own party, the Republican Party, to call this stuff out and end it. We got to move on. We have a president-elect in President-elect Biden. We have to move on. These officials that are Republicans, look at Georgia, Brad Raffensperger, Gabriel Sterling, Jeff Duncan. These are Republicans that are putting country over party. They're being subjected to just horrific threats as a result. This is not America.
Well, thank you, Mr. Krebs. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your indulgence. And Mr. Krebs, thank you for your patriotism.
Thanks, Senator Hassan. Senator Scott went to vote. So is Senator Rosen available?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning to all the witnesses here today. I want to start out by saying, as members of Congress, we take an oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We have a responsibility to our constituents and our nation to defend our democratic process. With that being said, Mr. Krebs, we thank you for your service to our nation and for upholding your oath to defend the Constitution from foreign and domestic threats. Your efforts to protect the integrity of our democratic process help ensure that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history, as certified by the Department of Homeland Security. I'd also publicly like to thank Nevada's election workers, who, despite Mr. Bunnell's comments in the media and here today, worked long hours to ensure that Nevada's elections were free, fair, and secure. Both our Republican Secretary of State and our Democratic Attorney General have stated there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud that occurred in Nevada, and our highest court has said the same, and I will not give this false narrative about my state any more attention than it has already unfortunately received. However, we do know that foreign adversaries like Russia have peddled false narratives. September 3rd, the Department of Homeland Security warned that Russia has been spreading disinformation about the integrity of U.S. elections since March. This evidence is alarming. According to Althea Group, ahead of the election, Russian media sources like RT and Sputnik were already pushing the narrative that the U.S. would not conduct free and fair elections. Last month, the Election Integrity Partnership found that social media accounts tied to Russian Internet Research Agency amplified claims of election fraud leading up to the 2020 election. Mr. Krebs, to reiterate, were there any election systems successfully hacked by foreign adversaries in the 2020 election?
Ma'am, having been out of the job now for 5 weeks or so, based on what I understood when I left, I'm not aware of any voting machine involved in the casting or counting of votes in this election or the certification process that was accessed by a foreign adversary.
Thank you. So I want to just emphasize the difference between election interference and influence. So we know our election infrastructure was secure from interference. I want to turn to the issue of foreign influence campaigns. In your view, did adversaries succeed in amplifying the false perception our election process was fraudulent? And really, can you explain how domestic actors amplified foreign disinformation campaigns and how that undermines confidence in our democratic process?
So I think what we saw, I believe it was October 22nd, we did see some Iranian efforts. I've talked about this before, where there were some emails that popped up on that day claiming to be purportedly from at least the Proud Boys that were talking about, sent specifically to Democratic voters. It said, you need to change your registration and vote for President Trump. If you don't, we will find you and take care of business, I guess. The issue there is that ballot secrecy is the law in all 50 states. And so we identified that issue. We isolated it. And then put up a rumor control debunker. And in the meantime, in the ensuing 27 hours, we were able to determine that was in fact an Iranian operation. And I think what was one of the true success stories of the Protect 2020 effort and defending democracy this time around was the fact that rather than, 4 months, in 27 hours, we went from detection to sharing that information with the American people. There is one element that doesn't get a lot of play, though, is that prior to making that assessment, following up on my commitment to our partners in the state and local election community, we held a call with the election officials and said, look, this is what we're seeing. You need to know this. And then we went to the public.
Mr. Krebs, I just have about 2.5 minutes left. So I would like to yield the rest of my time to you, because you did take an oath to uphold the Constitution when you were sworn in as director of CISA. And so I want you to address anything that you feel we haven't already asked today and give you an opportunity to speak in the last 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you for that courtesy. Look, I could not be more proud of my team at CISA for the work they did, not just protecting the 2020 election, but in getting through the last 9 months of all the stresses that COVID placed on the workforce and coming to work each day, whether they're sitting at home, out in the field, or the limited folks that came into the office. So that's point one. Point two was I firmly believe that this Protect 2020 effort, working with our partners in the federal government, whether it was in the intelligence community or the Department of Defense, was the single best representation of a unified government effort. Everybody got it. There were no turf wars. There was no parochialism. Everybody was on the same page. So we were defending democracy. The last thing I'll say is that the real heroes here are the state and local election workers out there across the country, the hundreds of thousands of election workers that risk their lives. And that's not a joke, right? There's a global pandemic. There's COVID spreading across the country. They went to work so that you and I could go vote and cast our decision here, contribute to this process. They had to deal with incredible adversity. And then at the end of it, risking their lives, they get death threats for doing their jobs, for standing up, speaking truth to power, putting country over party. That's got to end. We're going to have to move past this somehow. I've said before that democracy, we survived this, I think. It was strong enough to survive, but democracy in general is fragile. It requires commitment, follow through on both sides. If a party fails to participate in the process and instead undermines the process, we risk losing that democracy. We have to come back together as a country.
Again, I thank you for being here. I thank you for you and your teams around the country for keeping us safe and working so hard in this past election. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Scott is not back yet. Senator Portman, are you on WebEx? Senator Hawley, are you on WebEx? I'll try Senator Sinema. Well, then I'll pick up the slack. Mr. Banal, I want to explore a little bit further in terms of what access you did not have to the information you requested to verify this. Again, I value the paper backups, I value the controls, but they're only as good as they're actually used, and they only provide confidence to the extent that it's a transparent process. So just speak a little bit to what you had access to, what you did not have access to, what you're denied, and then go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The very sad fact is that we were denied access to almost anything meaningful that would allow us to verify.
Can you be specific?
Absolutely, Senator. Let's talk about the paper backups on the electronic machines. We were denied any access to those except from one machine in the entire state of Nevada. We were denied that access. That I wish I could have quoted Mr. Krebs when we were fighting our discovery fights at the in Nevada, saying how important it was to get access to these. We couldn't see any paper backups, and on top of that, the printers on the machine were malfunctioning at such a high rate. We doubt that the paper backups were actually giving us anything of use anyhow. So these paper backups that are supposed to provide such transparency, we couldn't use them. We couldn't see them. We couldn't use they provided us zero transparency at all, except in one machine in the entire state of Nevada. Another example is the fact that we were denied any meaningful discovery in the case in order to go and examine the full extent of the voter fraud. For instance, even when we were able to subpoena the records that led us to discover those 4,000 non-citizens who voted, we couldn't put that into evidence because we didn't get them until the end of the discovery period, and then the court said, well, at that point it's too late. Our discovery period was essentially 3 days. And we were denied any meaningful opportunity to even use in our case the information that we got. And the court didn't even consider those things, unfortunately. We were denied, we tried to be able to understand the code of these machines, to be able to find out, for instance, as the chairman pointed out, whether machines were hooked up to the internet, whether any of that happened, be able to do a forensic review. We brought forensic experts all the way to Nevada, people that could have discovered this information, people that could have told us what happened with these machines, and we weren't allowed near them. We weren't allowed any forensic audit of it. Nothing that could have given us any transparency, because transparency is not political. That's what we've talked about here. That's what we were denied in Nevada, is any attempt to actually find out what happened. Here's the troubling thing, is one of the reasons that they said that we couldn't get transparency on this machine is because they're proprietary. The information, the coding was proprietary. But we're talking about the countings of votes for the office of President of the United States, and they're not going to let us see the code for how they actually coded the votes? You got to pick one. It's either open source, and we exactly know the way that these machines are counting the votes, or you have to go back to a verifiable system to make sure that the results that are being reported are the results that we get from actual voters, because that is where democracy breaks down. That is really the fear that we have of losing democracy, is when it's not the people's votes that are being counted, but fraud that's being counted. And we can't just pretend that the emperor has any clothes if he doesn't. We can't pretend that we have a clean election when there's evidence to the contrary. And the way that we get that is through transparency. And we were denied that in Nevada at every single turn. We had a clerk who, a registrar of voters, who literally dodged our subpoenas. We had the holiday weekend over Thanksgiving in order to serve subpoenas. They locked the doors of the offices. He locked himself in his house. He refused to accept a subpoena. That same registrar of voters, we have a whistleblower that says he was wearing a Biden-Harris pin to inspect voter sites. This isn't something where we're trying to attack officials. We're trying to say that we have to make sure that it's nonpartisan, that we have to make sure that there's transparency. And you can't deny transparency at every turn, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Krebs, real quick, mindful that, again, all this testimony is under oath. So what you heard from Mr. Banal is testimony under oath. Does that trouble you? And in your assessment, this is the most secure election. Again, I'm all for paper backups. I'm all for those controls. I think if used, it works. We have a system of advocacy in terms of a legal system. You advocate for one side. It's a combative system, but both sides have to have information. Does that trouble you in terms of lack of transparency that Mr. Banal is testifying to under oath?
I think a couple things here. One is that in Commissioner Palmer's opening statement, he talked about the certification process, the voluntary voting systems guides, the certifications that happen at the state level, the logic and accuracy testing of these machines, the parallel testing that happens the day of or during the election process, the sampling and forensic audits. We saw Georgia do that with a number of their machines to ensure that the hashes match what they expected. I do think that yes, we need to make sure that working with these vendors that we have the appropriate insight and transparency into the process. Certainly, I think we need to have a conversation on what the appropriate auditing process looks like. I have seen some auditing that is not necessarily up to snuff, so we need to explore that a little bit more fully. But again, if you've got, we're talking about paper backups, but we're also talking about paper ballots.
But again, only if they have. He just said they didn't have access to the ballots.
I'm not.
All I'm asking, does that trouble you that there wasn't that kind of a transparency, or are you challenging his testimony?
Oh, of course not.
This system is, we only have confidence in it if it's completely transparent and somebody who's challenging results has access to the information. The paper ballot backup can have their forensic experts take a look at the computer systems, and that wasn't afforded. I'm just asking, does that concern you?
I think that there are multiple controls in place throughout the system. If there is a legal mechanism at the back end that allows for independent third-party auditing.
But that's the problem. The legal system didn't allow for the transparency. Okay, you can talk about all these controls up front, but then in the end, where there are affidavits signed and people are making charges, when you can't obtain the evidence to actually try it in court, and your evidence is denied in court, do you understand how that frustrates people? And that's the problem. That's why there's suspicions, because this was not, in so many cases that we've heard about, a transparent process. But with that, I'll turn to Senator Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. And I want to thank Chairman Johnson for taking all the heat for hosting a hearing like this. I think it's the right thing to do to get people to feel comfortable that our elections are free and fair. And if this one wasn't, that the next one will be. This is 2 years ago I got elected. I won election night by 54,000 votes. And Chuck Schumer sent a lawyer down and basically said, I don't care what the votes are, we're going to win through the courts. And we went through unbelievable number of lawsuits. We had, I think, something like 1,000 lawyers working with us. We went through 2 recounts. And he didn't care what the votes are. Chuck Schumer's goal was to win, and his lawyer was just to win through the courts. It didn't matter what the votes are. It didn't let me come to orientation. And so when I watch this stuff now, I did not remember one Democrat in this entire country say, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing it that way. They were all in on this, and nobody complained. So we've got to figure out how to do this where people feel comfortable. I can tell you, I live in Naples, Florida. Every time I go out, people come up to me and they're frustrated with the unfairness of the system. Now, of course, these are people that wanted Trump to win. They think that he lost unfairly, but they're mad. They're mad that because they hear about what happened in Wisconsin, they hear about what happened in other states, and then they're furious that they think the whole system's rigged. So one thing I did is in September, I put out a bill called the Voter ID. We do absentee ballots, and it actually works in Florida. You have to be a registered voter. Your signatures have to match. You have to get your vote in, ask for your vote early. You have to get your vote in on time. It's your problem if you don't. It's not somebody else's. You don't get to vote after the fact. Your vote doesn't get to come in after the fact, and somebody count it. Although 2 years ago, the Democrat lawyer tried to do that. And we know that we get the votes out on time. We did it this time. So it seems to me that if we want people to feel comfortable in this country that these elections are fair, you have to show your ID. You can't be doing same day registration, because how can you tell if somebody is legal, illegal? I mean, how would you know? Do they live in that state? How would you know? You got to let people be able to watch ballots being opened. We had 2 election supervisors that were removed because of what they did in my election. And they were clear. They completely violated the law, and they found and tried to count 95,000 ballots after election night. Not in my favor, of course, in the Democrats' favor. So Judge Stark, what do you think about the need to have local elections? Because I think what Mr. Krebs said is right. One of the reasons why we have good systems here is we don't have a national system. We have a local system. But should we have national standards? Should you have to have ID? Should your signatures have to match? Should you have to be? You can't get registered on the same day that you vote. All these things that we have, like we do in Florida, where you have to get your ballots early and all these things, and you know how many. By the way, you're supposed to announce how many ballots you have that night. You should know, right? They did in my election. And that's how they kept finding it. So, Judge Starr, what do you think about this idea that we have to have some national standards but still have local elections?
I think national standards need to be seriously considered in light of these recurring issues. We all have anecdotes. One of my friends, an academic leader in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I used to live, here's an anecdote. One of his students, a registered voter in Vermont, but she's studying in Virginia, and she receives appropriately an absentee ballot from Vermont, but she receives 4 unsolicited ballots from the Commonwealth of Virginia, where she happens to not be registered to vote, but she's studying. And everyone is hearing these anecdotes, and they're saying, well, aren't there control mechanisms in place? And so the issue of decentralization is you will continue to have these varieties and vagaries unless and until there is some enormous reforms in state government, or then Congress using its powers under Article 2, under Article 1 in this particular instance, says we need to step in and have regulations to ensure integrity. And a signature requirement is one of the bases. I like to say, Senator Scott, you've got to show ID if you want to check into a hotel or get intrusive TSA security. So don't we want to have those kinds of safeguards just to ensure, yes, this is going to be an honest election, which I think is all we are all asking for.
So, Mr. Trubus and Mr. Banal, if we had done some of these things and they'd been enforced in your states, would people feel comfortable that there was a fair election?
Senator Scott, I think it would absolutely go miles to make sure that people were confident in the results of the election if we put in simple methods to make sure that the people who vote are who they purport to be, that one person only gets one vote, that the way that the ballots are counted leads to an accurate total. These things shouldn't be partisan. These things should be exactly what we do to protect our republic and make it so that people know that the results are accurate. Because otherwise, you end up where we are today.
Senator, one of the fascinating things about Wisconsin is, as I said, we have a long history of real transparency in our process, in our recount process, in all of our processes. So it's particularly odd here. And several of the justices on our court this last week called what the Democrats had done in the majority of the court, in the Supreme Court, as absurd and bizarre. And the reason they referred to it that way is they said, the issue here is what confidence do people have in the election process? So if that's what we hear, and I've heard that, I've been hearing that all day here, confidence in the election process, well then why, when everything is teed up? I mean, I'm a former judge. My co-counsel is a former president of the state bar. We had teed up everything. We absolutely, you knew the names, addresses, wards. You had exact records. And what the Biden campaign did not want the court to do is to actually address the substantive question. That's the holding of the court. We won't address the substantive question. And the Chief Justice, I mean, it's a great frustration in the Chief Justice when she said, 4 members of this court throw the cloak of latches over numerous problems that will be repeated again and again until this court has the courage to correct them. Candidly, it was all Democrat talking points. I mean, they did this make the same thing. I heard something about Justice Karofsky's comment. It was just a talking point. And I guess the frustration you hear from those of us who are serious lawyers, who have taken this seriously, is that when we pose these matters to courts, we expect them to address them. When they don't, it undermines the integrity of our system. That's what's going on here. The frustration that you hear, even in good Democrat circles, is if the courts don't address these, who's going to? Aren't they the ultimate arbiters? There's no dispute that the election would have turned out differently in Wisconsin if, according to our allegations and according to our proofs, the court accepted those, that the election result would be different. But instead of addressing the substantive claims, the Biden campaign argues, don't talk about them. Don't address them. And that's why I thanked Senator Johnson when he first called and asked if I would talk, because if you don't inquire here in the Senate, and as Ken Starr said a minute ago, if you don't do this inquiry, there really isn't going to be any analysis, and there isn't going to be an opportunity to get the very integrity that we all want. I mean, as I said, as a former judge, this is a serious matter to me, and no one suggested at any point in the process that the allegations in Wisconsin are anything but serious and substantive and documented. And yet a court takes the Biden line and says, we're just not going to talk about it. And that's just wrong. And that's the reason, one of the reasons, people don't trust this outcome.
Yeah. In Florida, we have a lot of people that have moved from South America. And so a lot of them have said to me, how is this different than what Maduro's doing? Right? So, and part of it is, people don't have enough information, but it's so simplistic when you hear about people that are dead that are vote, people that don't live in the state to vote, and you hear all these things, and there's no recourse. So we've got to figure this out. We got to be able to prevent this from, I don't know if anything will happen with this election, but clearly we can't let this go on for the next election.
Certainly.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Scott, and I completely agree. You have to air these. You have to have the information. This is not a dangerous hearing. This is an incredibly important and crucial hearing. But thank you for participating in it. Senator Portman, are you available by WebEx?
I am, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I've been moving around the Capitol as we've had to vote, but I was at the hearing earlier, and I appreciate the witnesses and all the information we've received. And, as I look at this issue and even watch some of the back and forth today between our colleagues, it seems to me that pulling this out of politics a little bit and having a bipartisan group that is more independent look at the issue is a good idea, in part because most of us don't believe that this ought to be something that the federal government usurps from the states. In fact, we believe that the Constitution got it right and that, generally speaking, it's better to have the states handle this. But there are obviously many disparities between how the states do it. So there was discussion earlier, I think it was of the Carter-Baker Commission. I would ask you, Mr. Starr, is this time for us to establish a commission? I've been involved in some of these commissions. I've been a commissioner and co-chaired some that have worked, some that haven't worked. But often they can be quite effective at sort of taking the partisan poison out of an issue and addressing it in a very straightforward way. If you had a distinguished Democrat and a distinguished Republican and commissioners who are dedicated to increasing the confidence in our elections, do you think now is the time for us to establish such a commission that could report with plenty of time before the next midterm election and help to give the states a sense of direction and perhaps even a template of best practices?
The short answer is yes. In light of the acrimony and the division with respect to the 2000 election, bringing together Jimmy Carter and former Secretary of State Baker was, I think, very efficacious. They made thoughtful recommendations, but they bring attention and shed light on what the issues are. And so, yes, I think taking it out of what is clearly continuing to be a highly bitter and acrimonious discussion, and to say to the American people, we're going to take a look at this, and we're going to try to, in fact, improve in the great spirit of reform. We want honest elections. Abraham Lincoln, the subject of the fraudulent mail-in campaign. Let's not lose sight, even though I'm thankful that foreign interference and so forth, and I very much admire Mr. Krebs and all that. But we're really talking about down in the boiler room, so to speak, of American elections. And that's where I think these reforms need to be and safeguards need to be in place.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking forward to working with one of my Democratic colleagues to try to promote this idea. We've had some discussions of it already. And I think, again, today, what we've heard is indicative of the degree of intensity on this issue and the need for free and fair elections. I think everybody agrees with secure elections, absolutely. And you mentioned Mr. Krebs. Chris, thank you for your service at CISA. I agree with what was said earlier about the fact that during your time there, you were instrumental in building up our defenses on the cybersecurity side. Particularly, thank you for working with Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose so well. Frank LaRose and you, I think, we're able to provide some examples for other states, as I understand it. You can speak to that. But we have in every county in Ohio the so-called Albert Intrusion Detection Monitoring hardware, which is designed to detect suspicious cyber activity. Can you comment briefly on the benefits of using this kind of detection and monitoring hardware and how it worked?
Yes, sir. First off, I want to thank you for actually just the state of Ohio. For some reason, in my senior staff in my front office, two of my top 3 advisors happen to be from Ohio. So you're doing something right there. The Albert systems are intrusion detection.
I'm going to put on my mask after you said that, since Harper had his Ohio mask on earlier.
So the Albert systems are intrusion detection systems that effectively sit on the network, sit on the wire, that capture traffic, that we can work with our intelligence community partners and develop what's known as signatures, looking for known malicious activity or known interaction with suspicious IP addresses, just looking for bad interaction. And it gives us a good insight into what sort of behaviors may be happening on those networks. And they are actually pretty key after the 2016 election. Once we were able to get a sense of what was happening in Illinois, we could load up some of those signatures and then go do forensics. It is a passive system. It's a forensic system. Where we need to go, though, is building on the trust we've developed through the Albert sensors and through the ISAC and through the coordinating councils, to start deploying more advanced technologies. And I'm specifically talking about some of the endpoint detection and response capabilities that'll actually sit on a computer in a state and local office and be more of a real-time monitoring and mitigation capability. That's how we continue moving forward. We need the same capability in the federal government. We're not there yet, but we have to continue advancing. And I think Congress... I'll stop.
Yeah, Chris, and I, again, as you know, I've talked about this. I appreciate what you did for elections. I also am very concerned that our federal government is not up to the task generally. And that's another topic for another hearing, perhaps one where you'll be back to testify. But look what's happened just recently. In the last week, we found out that a very sophisticated group of hackers got into the computers of some of our most sensitive agencies. And so we obviously have a lot of work to do. And I'm not suggesting that CISA was at fault there. But on the other hand, I think we have not yet given even CISA adequate resources and authority to be able to handle all these issues, not just the election issues. But obviously, we have a huge problem right now with cyber attacks, and we don't know all the details yet. And I want to ask you to get into stuff you don't know about. But it was a massive cyber attack on federal agencies that undercut our national security. We know that. By the way, Senator Paul earlier talked about the fact that there has been some lack of understanding between what you testified to and what you stated as to the election being secure from cyber attacks, and this notion that there were not instances of irregularity and fraud in this election, which of course there have been in every election in the history of our country, and there were in this election, and we've heard about some of those today. Is Senator Paul correct? And I guess I would slightly amend what he said. He said that your focus was just on foreign adversaries. My sense is your focus was not just on foreign adversaries, although you feel fairly confident that that did not happen this time. And obviously, based on what happened in 2016 with the Russians, this is good news. But also with regard to domestic cyber attacks, is that what your report was about? Is he accurate in saying that?
Yes, sir. So, when you come into federal office, you pledge the oath to uphold and defend the Constitution from threats, foreign and domestic, and that's what we did. The focus of the statement, the joint statement, was security. It was secure. I think terms have been conflated here. Alleging that we were speaking to the fraud aspect. We absolutely were not. We were talking about security, hacking, manipulation of these machines. That was the thrust of the statement.
Yeah, I think that's very important to point out. And I think a number of people were confused about that, including perhaps some folks in the administration. Post-election, there's been a lot of talk about signature matching. And I'll end with this, Mr. Chairman. I know we're getting over time here, but in Ohio, what we do is, and we've been doing this for 15 years quite successfully, we send out an application for an absentee ballot. It's then a no-fault absentee. That's how I vote. But you have to send in an application including a signature. Those signatures are checked. Then the signature on the actual ballot, once you receive the ballot, you send that in. You have another signature, that's checked. And then, of course, the two are compared. They also, in Ohio, have access to other signatures if there is some confusion as to whether it might be the right person or not. Could you, Mr. Krebs, or others, perhaps comment on that system? Is that a good way to ensure that you have the protection that we all want to have, that the person who requested the ballot is an eligible voter, and that the return ballot was completed by that same person?
Not an expert on the system. Seems reasonable to me.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Sir, this is State Representative Frank Ryan. I would tell you that is a good system, and that would alleviate a significant number of the concerns that I had in the election. And based upon some of the comments that were made by many of the senators and the testifiers, I would indicate that we saw a major problem with the dot-com bubble in 2001, which led to the Sarbanes-Oxley bill, much of which is the basis of my testimony today. Then in 2008 and 2009, we had the crisis that happened in the banking industry with the no documentation loans. We saw how that worked out and led to the Dodd-Frank bill. I would hope that would happen in 2000 elections and in the Abraham Lincoln election, in this most recent one in 2016 and 2020. There would be similar legislation that could help us restore the confidence that people have that there's some degree of uniform perspective about the requirements that each of the states needs to be able to comply with. What Ohio is doing would have alleviated a major amount of the concerns I had when we had a Supreme Court that decided to legislate from the bench.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may say just a word, and that is, I think what Senator Portman, you have identified is a best practice. And it certainly qualifies as one of the things that perhaps a commission, if one is found, could say, we have canvassed the entire 50 states, and here are the best practices. The recommendations could be based on experience as opposed to simply theoretical constructs. Let's just see what has worked in the various states with reputations for honesty and integrity.
Yeah, that would be the objective. Thank you, Mr. Darn. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your indulgence.
Thank you very much, Senator Portman. Now, on behalf of the chairman, I'm going to recognize myself. So thanks to the witnesses for being here. I just want to say how important it is that we're having today's hearing. Let me just give you an example why. Yesterday, I'm from the state of Missouri. Yesterday, I was talking with some of the constituents back at home, a group of about 30 people. Every single one of them told me that they felt they had been disenfranchised, that their votes didn't matter, that the election had been rigged. These are normal, reasonable people. These are not crazy people. These are reasonable people, and who, by the way, have been involved in politics. They've won, they've lost, they've seen it all. These are normal folks living normal lives who firmly believe that they have been disenfranchised, and to listen to the mainstream press and quite a few voices in this building tell them after 4 years of nonstop Russia hoax, it was a hoax. It was based on, the whole Russian nonsense was based on, we now know, lies from a Russian spy. The Steele dossier was based on a Russian spy. After 4 years of that, being told that the last election was fake and that Donald Trump wasn't really elected and that Russia intervened, after 4 years of that, now these same people are told, you just sit down and shut up. If you have any concerns about election integrity, you're a nutcase. You should shut up. Well, I tell you what, 74 million Americans are not going to shut up, and telling them that their views don't matter and that their concerns don't matter and they should just be quiet is not a recipe for success in this country. It's not a recipe for the unity that I hear now the other side is suddenly so interested in after years of trying to delegitimize President Donald Trump. So suffice it to say, I'm not too keen on lectures about how Missourians and others who voted for President Trump and now have some concerns about fraud, about integrity, about compliance with the law should just be quiet, and that they are somehow not patriotic if they raise these questions. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. Let me talk about the First Amendment. Judge Starr, I want to begin with you, because I know that you have spent much of your life as a litigator defending the First Amendment. Have you ever seen anything like we saw in the closing days of the election, when you had the biggest corporations in the history of this country, the most powerful corporations in the world, Facebook, Twitter, working with the Democrat campaign to suppress legitimate reporting on Hunter Biden, who we now know is under federal investigation for criminal wire fraud, tax evasion, other things? Have you ever seen anything in your career like that, Judge Starr, where we have these giant corporate conglomerates censoring and suppressing news directly bearing on an election weeks beforehand, and doing it apparently in conjunction with one of the major political parties? Have you ever seen anything like that?
No, I think we live in a new age, and we need to go back to great lessons from constitutional law, as you well know, Senator Hawley, and Justice William Brennan, an icon of the Warren Court, saying that our democracy is based upon robust and uninhibited debate. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, let's test things in the marketplace of ideas. You can't test places, ideas and theories unless you allow the marketplace of information communication to flourish.
Well said. I agree with that 100%. And, you know, it's an extraordinary thing not to be able to get. I've had Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg under oath. We've asked them, did you coordinate with the Democrat campaign? How was it that within minutes of this story breaking, that both of those major corporate giants decided that they would suppress this story, and exactly what the Biden campaign wanted them to do? They won't answer questions. I've asked the FEC to determine whether or not this was an illegal campaign contribution on the part of these corporate entities. And I just can't fathom why anybody who cares about free speech in this country would be fine with these mega corporations controlling what people can and cannot say and trying to intervene in a presidential election. Let me ask you, Judge Starr, about something else. Let's talk a little bit about mail-in balloting. In your written testimony, you discussed the findings of the Carter-Baker Commission, and you've mentioned that again here today. That commission commented on the use of mail-in ballots after the 2000 election. Can you tell us a little bit about that commission's finding on mail-in ballots, as you recall it, and talk about some of the warnings that commission put into place?
Yes, the commission was referring to absentee ballots, but of course, in light of what has happened in this presidential election, we're now talking about the unprecedented use of mail-in ballots. And their concern and their warning of former President Carter and Secretary of State Baker is that this is a mechanism or a platform for fraud and abuse. Be careful about it. Have safeguards in place. And I think that's at the bottom what some of these concerns are. How did dead people vote, accepting that allegation from Nevada? It is because of inadequate safeguards. The dead person didn't walk into the ballot, into the voting booth and vote. Someone voted for him or her. We have to have those safeguards in place. And that's what the commission was saying and issuing that fervent warning that it may get worse in a deeply divided country.
26 states, as I understand it, when it comes to mail-in voting, Judge, 26 states now in this country allow third-party ballot harvesting of mail-in votes. That's where you can pay a third party to go distribute the ballots. And you can't do this in my home state of Missouri because we have controls similar to those in Ohio that Senator Portman was talking about. But in other states, 26 states, you can pay a third party to go distribute the ballots. You can pay a third party to pick up the ballots. There's no chain of custody there. There's no verification. This seems to me an invitation to fraud and abuse. I've introduced legislation to end third-party ballot harvesting nationwide, to make it illegal nationwide. Would you agree, Judge Starr, that looking at something like third-party ballot harvesting is a common sense approach? By the way, some House Democrats even have endorsed this approach. Would you agree with me that that's a common sense place to start when we think about preventing fraud and addressing it in our elections?
Yes, because the opportunity for fraud and abuse is so rife and omnipresent with that kind of, if I may now call it that, worst practice. So many states have best practices. We heard from Senator Portman about Ohio. Other states have these safeguards in place. Let's put safeguards in place, but one of them is let's eliminate practices that are so prone to fraud and abuse.
And I think that's just the very beginning of what we should do. We should also make sure that poll watchers from both parties can be present at all times, that there are eyes on ballots, cameras on ballots at all times, that there's signature verification requirements that are mandatory, that there's mandatory reporting requirements about where we are in the count, where the states are, so the states just can't go dark for days at a time. All of this stuff ought to be common sense. There is no reason we should just shrug our shoulders and say, well, fraud happens all the time, no big deal. It is a big deal. It's a very big deal. And for millions and millions of Americans in this election, it's a very, very big deal indeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley, for your questions and for standing in. Based on one question and the answer from Judge Starr, I just want to read from my opening statement from last hearing. In his reflections on progress, peaceful coexistence, and intellectual freedom, Russian dissident Andrei D. Sakharov wrote, quote, "The second basic thesis is that intellectual freedom is essential to human society. Freedom to obtain and distribute information, freedom for open-minded and unfearing debate, and freedom from pressure by officialdom and prejudices. Such a trinity of freedom of thought is the only guarantee against an infection of people by mass myths, which, in the hands of treacherous hypocrites and demagogues, can be transformed into bloody dictatorship. Freedom of thought is the only guarantee of the feasibility of a scientific, democratic approach to politics, economics, and culture." I like to think of this hearing as a demonstration that freedom to obtain and distribute information to the public. There's nothing dangerous about that. It is essential to our freedom. It's essential to our country, to our democratic republic, and is essential if we're going to restore confidence in this election system we have. We have to do this. We can't ignore the problem. The first step in solving any problem is admitting you have one and then dealing with it honestly, gathering the information. This hearing, as all my hearings have been a problem-solving process, first gathering the information. That's what we're trying to do here today. Senator Sinema.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. The 2020 Arizona election was a successful election, not for any one party or individual, but for our democracy, and as a demonstration of the will of Arizona voters. A record 80% of registered voters participated. Arizonans are independent. They vote for state and federal representatives they trust to be honest, who they believe will fight for and uphold Arizona values. This record turnout number is also a testament to the work of Arizona election officials who not only ensured our system worked and our laws were upheld, but did so while ensuring that people could safely participate in the election during the pandemic as voters and volunteers. Arizona has had some sort of absentee voting by mail for over 100 years. In 1992, the Arizona legislature and governor, in bipartisan fashion, made it easier for Arizonans to vote by mail by no longer requiring a reason to participate. Our vote by mail system has a number of safeguards to ensure safe elections. Ballots are mailed out 28 days prior to the election, and each ballot has a tracking mechanism. We use tamper-resistant envelopes, and ballot drop boxes have specific security requirements. Election staff are trained to authenticate signatures, and a voter is contacted if the signature cannot be verified. Arizona also has severe criminal penalties for ballot tampering or for throwing out someone's ballot. In 2018, when I was elected to the United States Senate, nearly 80% of Arizona voters voted early, most of them by mail. In 2020, that increased to 88%. That's 2.9 million votes moving through the postal system in Arizona. Arizona's postal workers put in long hours, many working 65 hours a week for weeks on end, to ensure that ballots got to voters and were returned by state deadlines so they could be counted. Even though many postal facilities in Arizona are short-staffed right now, these essential workers didn't shy away from the challenge or the need to protect our democracy. Arizonans know it takes time to count our votes and determine election winners. When I was elected to the Senate, I was declared the winner 6 days, but it took 12 days to finish counting the votes. Now, that's not an indication of fraud. It shows that election officials are following the law and counting all the votes. That's how elections have worked in Arizona since our state adopted widespread mail-in voting. And it's how things worked in Arizona again in 2020. Our elections this year produced bipartisan results, where members of both parties won elections. Arizona's statewide elected officials from both parties have also confirmed that our election was fair, just, and without fraud. Katie Hobbs, Arizona's Democratic Secretary of State, on December 9th said this about our election. This election is one for the record books for a number of reasons. Participation was at a historic high, as was interest in the inner workings of this civic process, which is the kind of scrutiny that pushes the process to be better. I have full confidence in this election. That confidence has been affirmed by the courts. On November 20th, Clint Hickman, the chairman of the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors, a Republican, said, "No matter how you voted, this election was administered with integrity, transparency, and most importantly, in accordance with Arizona state laws." And on December 4th, the Republican Speaker of the Arizona State House, Rusty Bowers, rejected calls for the state legislature to change the result of Arizona's election. Here's his quote: "As a conservative Republican, I don't like the results of the presidential election. I voted for President Trump and I worked hard to re-elect him. But I cannot and will not entertain a suggestion that we violate current law to change the outcome of a certified election. I and my fellow legislators swore an oath to support the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution and laws of the state of Arizona. It would violate that oath, the basic principles of Republican government, and the rule of law if we attempted to nullify the people's vote based on unsupported theories of fraud." Challenges contesting the Arizona election were brought to the courts and dismissed, including a unanimous ruling by the Arizona Supreme Court confirming a lower court ruling upholding the results of the election challenge. This is how our system works. If there are concerns of fraud or abuse, the courts consider the evidence and make a ruling. Now, I have a few questions for Mr. Krebs. During your work at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, did you find any evidence that disputes the statements I shared from elected officials regarding the integrity and fairness of the 2020 election in Arizona?
No, ma'am.
More broadly, what evidence can you offer to support the idea that the election across the country, not just in Arizona, was fair and secure?
Again, it's those layered security controls that are in place before, during, and after an election. The thing that I always like to point back to is that increase of paper ballots across the country and the ability to then conduct post-election audits. In Arizona, I believe it was a 2% audit. In Georgia, they did a risk-limiting audit that then triggered a full hand tally. The outcomes were consistent. 5% audit in Wisconsin, 2% audit in Pennsylvania. Those are the sorts of things that give you confidence in the process when you can go and recount the ballots over and over and over.
What lessons should we learn from the 2020 election as we plan for future elections?
We need to invest in democracy. First and foremost, we need to fully eradicate those machines that don't have paper ballots, so those direct recording electronic machines. There's only one state that's statewide, and that's Louisiana, but they are throughout Texas, Indiana, Tennessee, and a couple other states, including New Jersey. We need to get those out of the system. So Congress needs to fully invest in a risk-based approach to eradicate those. We need to also continue investing in post-election audit capabilities for the state. That takes a little bit more time. And then a steady stream of funding and grants on a regular basis, not every 10 years or every 4 years, but on a regular, dependable basis to support elections. And along the same lines, we need to fully fund and support the Election Assistance Commission. They're a critical tool to helping the administration of elections. And lastly, and this is my pet project here, we need to reinvest in civics education and K through 12 throughout the country. We have to continue educating our children on what it means to be an American and the democracy that we're enjoying here.
Thank you. And my last question. Early in this election cycle, CISA and the FBI highlighted the potential threat that foreign elements could pose to the U.S. election system through disinformation campaigns. Looking back, did the U.S. do enough to prepare for this threat from both foreign and domestic actors?
Ma'am, we had the distinct advantage this time around of having about 3.5 to 4 years to prepare for this election. And that's in comparison to the prior administration. They only had about 4 months. We had 4 years. I know my team, we took every moment of the day to think through any number of scenarios. I've talked about it often that I was paranoid, that we were looking for every angle that we possibly could. And I think that ultimately benefited us from a preparation perspective when it came around, and that we had a full range of scenarios we'd work through, that we'd improve security at the state level. But ultimately, it came down to those perception hacks. It came down to disinformation. And I think rumor control was an incredibly valuable tool that we need to think about from a government-wide perspective, how rumor control, I've said rumor control as a service. How can we use rumor control to help ensure counter disinformation on the vaccine for COVID as it rolls out? Those are the sorts of things we need to be thinking about.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I overextended my time. I yield back and thank you for your indulgence.
Well, thank you, Senator Sinema, for participating. I do want to just warn Mr. Palmer and Mr. Ryan, first of all, apologize for not having maybe any questions directed your way. I will, at the tail end of this, we have another quick round of questions here. Senator Peters has some. But I will ask you a couple questions. Then what I will tell all the witnesses as a final summary, this actually got from this technique from Senator Carper, is we'll give you each an opportunity to make kind of a final statement, things that either you weren't asked that you wanted to be asked about, or something that you just think needs to be said during this hearing. So we'll do that, but I'll first turn it over to Senator Peters for some extra questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A question for Mr. Krebs. As you know, you and I have spoken about the rise of domestic extremist violence in the country and how we need to be conscious of that rise. And in August, the FBI and Department of Homeland Security memos reportedly warned of threats by domestic extremists to election-related targets in the run-up to the 2020 election. Unfortunately and sadly, these warnings seem to have been well warranted. Since President Trump's false claims of widespread voter fraud, local election officials across the nation have faced harassment. Some of them have faced death threats against themselves and their families. In Michigan, our Secretary of State had protesters surround her home while she was decorating it with her young child to get ready for Christmas. According to local law enforcement, many of those folks were armed. They were repeating some of the president's false allegations of widespread fraud in an intimidating way. And after speaking out defending the integrity of the 2020 election, it's my understanding that you and your family also faced threats. In fact, it required us to take some and make some arrangements for your security to be here today to testify in person. On December 1st of this year, a top Republican election official, Gabrielle Sterling, in the Georgia Secretary of State's office, held a news conference urging President Trump and Republican lawmakers to stop attacking Georgia's election system with baseless claims of voter fraud. And in that news conference, Mr. Sterling said, President Trump was, and I'm quoting Mr. Sterling here, quote, inspiring people to commit potential acts of violence, end of quote, and that, new quote, someone's going to get hurt, someone's going to get shot, someone's going to get killed, end of quote. Now, we saw a similar dangerous trend earlier this year when election officials questioned COVID public health safety protocols and also fueled extremists, including in my home state, extremists that targeted the governor of the state of Michigan. So my question for you, Mr. Krebs, particularly given the fact that you've faced some of this, do you believe Mr. Sterling's statements are overstated, or that unfortunately that real-world violence stemming from dangerous claims can indeed be a realistic concern that we should be conscious of?
Absolutely. He himself received a number of threats, and he has continued to receive threats, as I understand it. Secretary Raffensperger down there has. I've continued to receive threats. I think, and it's not just the heads of, the principal level people, the directors of the offices. He was having IT contractors that were receiving death threats. We're seeing stoking of fires that is completely unnecessary with claims that are, I'm not even talking about some of the court cases. I'm talking about in my case and in many of our cases is these fanciful claims of dead dictators and computer algorithms, and we're debunking them because they're nonsense, and we've said that from the beginning. But they've taken root, and some people just don't want to hear how these systems actually work and what's actually capable across these systems, and most importantly, those I'm gonna say it again. The paper ballots. It's those measure the root of trust in the process that can dispense with these claims, even if these algorithms were there. They didn't work, but they're probably not there. So we've got to move past this. In these cases of threats, they need to be prosecuted. People need to, be held accountable for the claims they're making.
Yeah, and just the last question, and we've spoke about this earlier, that if you look at the fact that we were able to conduct this election in a fair way during the middle of a pandemic, which is an extraordinary time to try to conduct fair elections and do it as efficiently as possible, and the fact that you have thousands of election officials and volunteers that are working. I think of the men and women who went to the polling places to process voting, did it with concerns about their health, people who went to vote or for their health, or folks who chose to vote absentee in order to minimize the risk to their families, to the health of their families. This is really, in my mind, a time to celebrate a very successful election that was done fairly. And it was done in the midst of an extraordinary time that we're living in. And it's the result of folks in CISA, your folks, others with Homeland Security, folks with the FBI and others. Would you just comment on that as to how we should look at what we just went through? And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at ways to improve the system, to make sure that we minimize clerical errors, to make sure that if there are isolated incidents of fraud, that they're dealt with and they're caught. But we should be also celebrating what just was pulled off in this country, which is an example of how a democratic system can work efficiently, fairly, and even do it under extraordinary pressure.
I absolutely agree with the earlier conversation about the need for a national conversation about how to improve trust in the elections. I think, things I've even recommended about eliminating the DREs and having more audits available after the election. And that's going to require, again, that policy conversation. It's going to require investing in democracy. But we do need to recognize the fact that this was a historic election. We had 100 million voters by November 3rd. That shows that people wanted to get out there and vote. They wanted to participate in this process. And all along, we have hundreds of thousands of election workers out there that, as you've pointed out, as I said in my opening statement, that risked their lives in a global pandemic to make sure that we could all get out there and vote. So we need to support them. I have significant concerns that the targeted violence against these election workers is going to have a chilling effect on turnout of election workers in the future. If there's no election workers, it's really hard to do an election. So we need to think about that and how to counter that going forward.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Peters. Now, this is a number of times we've talked about threat and violence against election workers, which obviously nobody on this committee condones at all. At all. I certainly hope there's not an inference in all this discussion that this hearing is going to spawn some of that. Anybody listening to this hearing, do not engage in that. Okay? I wish Senator Paul were actually here to talk about his scrape with threats and violence in the political realm. They're in a terrible position in this country where you have this level of threat across the political spectrum. Nobody should condone it. Certainly not this committee, certainly not this chairman. But that's what I think this hearing is about, is to provide the information, talk honestly about it, take a look at allegations. If they can be explained, take them off the table. There's plenty that as we were doing our preparation for this hearing, we were able to take off the table. But that's what this is about. This is about information, obtaining it, the freedom to obtain it and disseminate it. Information. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And again, our thanks to our witnesses. You've been patient, been here for a long time. Those of you that are here personally and those that are connected from afar. I mentioned earlier I'd gone to Ohio State. Fortunately, nobody in my family ever graduated from college. I won this Navy ROTC scholarship. I got to go to college, and the first in my family, I think, to graduate from college. And when I got to Ohio State, I found out there's a little town just north of Columbus called Delaware. And so my 4 years at Ohio State, I'm thinking of Delaware. I'm thinking, it's a little town just north of Columbus. And then I found out later on it's a state. And when I finished up my active duty at the end of the Vietnam War and moved from California to Delaware to get an MBA, I learned it on December 7th, 1787. December 7th, 1787. Delaware became the first colony to ratify the Constitution. And then 12 others followed suit, and we ended up with a country that prevails to this day. A little bit of a student of history, I know we all are, but one of the things I learned about the framers, the Constitutional Convention up in Philadelphia, just north of where my wife and I live, our family lived just north of Wilmington, is they disagreed on a bunch of stuff. They disagreed on about probably the hardest thing for them to agree on, as it turns out, was should there be a judiciary? Article 2, I think it is, but should there be a judiciary? And if so, who's going to pick the judges? And they argued and argued for days, weeks, trying to figure it out. And somebody came up with the idea and finally said, it shouldn't just be the Senate, it shouldn't just be the House. It ought to be the president to appoint with the advice and consent of the Senate. And so they voted on it, and they voted it down. And they, whenever they'd run into an impasse up in Philadelphia, they would bring in faith leaders to come in and pray for wisdom for our framers. And they did that again. And they debated some more for days, and finally somebody said, why don't we just go back to that earlier idea and vote on it again? And they did. And they adopted clause that says the president shall nominate with the advice and consent of the Senate those who will serve lifetime terms. Right, extraordinary. As our judges. Is it a perfect solution? No. We've been wrestling for 200 some years, figuring out what is the advice and consent of the Senate. What's that really mean? And we just in recent months, we've been wrestling again with that. But it's an imperfect solution to a very real challenge. And that is that we're going to have disagreements and we're going to have disputes that need to be resolved. We need some, this is before, I was talking about football earlier. In baseball, they call balls and strikes. But the framers, they didn't have baseball to talk about, but they knew they needed somebody to call balls and strikes and to have a system that most people say, well, that's fair and reasonable. Well, we've needed folks judges, federal judges and others, to be able to call balls and strikes. In all these litigation, 61 instances around the country, 61. And they've done that. And some people like the results, and other people don't. And I think what I want to, 2 points to make in closing is, before I have to go to another meeting, but one of those is at some point in time, we have to say enough's enough. It's time to turn the page, and let's get about our nation's work. Here this week, and we were just voting on the floor, and people are talking to me about negotiations are going on this COVID package, on digesting the climate change and ways that create jobs, all kind of stuff that's in play. Literally right now, it's an exciting time to be in the Senate, and I'm encouraged by that. The other thing I'd say, in the Navy, I was a naval flight officer, later a P-3 aircraft mission commander for a long time, active in reserve. But in naval aviation, especially in P-3 community, you have a job in the airplane on the crew, you have a job on the ground. And for a while, my job was, I was a squadron's air intelligence officer when we were in Southeast Asia. And so I have a huge respect for intelligence agencies, and we got a bunch of them. They're really good ones. One of our friends, one of our former colleagues, was the former senator from Indiana, and he ended up as a DNI, Director of National Intelligence, and a good friend of I think all of us. And Dan, I talked to him when he stepped down as head of DNI, and I asked him. I said, just talk to me as a friend and off the record. And I guess I'm going on the record, but I said, are you convinced that are you convinced that the Russians were involved in trying to put their hands or fingers on the scales on the presidential elections in 2016? He said, without a doubt they were. And I said, well, there's like 17 or so intelligence agents. They say, does some of them feel that way? And he said, no, all of us do. It's unanimous. Everybody feels that the Russians were interfering in our election in 2016, and they wanted to change the outcome. And they said they weren't trying to help Hillary Clinton. They were trying to help Donald Trump. And I'm not asserting that they were doing that at his request, but in a way, maybe they were, come to think of it. But there's no question they were involved, and with the purpose was a single purpose: the Russians, and we caught them red-handed, and we've been dwelling on that for 4 years now. We need to get over it. We need to get over it. I respect enormously the work of our intelligence agencies. I think we all do, but we need to put that in the pandemic. We need to put that in our rearview mirror. And if we're ever going to put this pandemic in the rearview mirror, we got to figure out how to provide vaccinations timely, promptly, correctly to about 250 million Americans. If we don't vaccinate kids under the age of 7, there's 250 million Americans. We got to get vaccinated not once, but twice in the right sequence. Good record keeping. Got to convince about 30% of people in this country that it's safe to do this. We have to set an example for that. We got a lot of work to do. If we do that, we'll be on our way coming out of this recession and on our way to better days ahead for our country and for the people who really are counting on us. So I'd ask us to keep our eye on the ball. Well, let me close with, Mr. Chairman, if I could. We only have 3 counties in Delaware. The southernmost county is called Sussex County. And there's a town in Sussex County called Seaford, which is famous for being the first nylon plant in the world. It was built in Seaford, Delaware. And they had like 4,000 people working there from World War II up until about 10 years ago. And there's a church close to the plant there. It's a Methodist church. And the minister used to be there as an old guy, Reverend Reynolds, whose son was a Republican state rep and a football coach and a great guy. And Reverend Reynolds, when I got elected governor, he said to me, he wanted to come and sit and talk to me and visit with me and share some thoughts. And I said, sure. And everybody's known in our lives, I'm sure a chairman or ranking member, people that we've known in our lives, they're just wise. They just have a lot of wisdom, and every now and then they share it with us. And he came to meet with me, and he said these words. We had a lovely conversation. I actually had lunch together. And he said to me, just remember this, Tom. He said, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. That's what he said. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. I sat there and I said, what in the world are you talking about? It took me a while to figure it out, but I finally did. And I would just say, the main thing here is to keep the main thing the main thing. And that is, we have this gift, the Constitution, that's not perfect, but it actually puts us on a course for a more perfect union, a more perfect union. Hopefully we're going to learn from these, what we did well in this election and what we didn't. And years from now, people look back and said, well, they kept their eye on the ball. They kept their eye on the main thing. If we do that, history will look well on our efforts. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, to our ranking member, Senator Peters. Thank you. And to our witnesses again, thank you all.
And thank you, Senator Carper. And again, appreciate your outreach this morning. I would say the main thing of this hearing is the fact that we need to have confidence in the integrity of our election. And we have to recognize the reality that right now, and quite honestly for the last 4 years, that hasn't existed. 2016, illegitimate result, resistant. You remember the famous tweet by Mark Zaid. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but something like, coup's begun, impeachment will follow. That's what we've been living with 4 years. Different election, different result, different side. And the reality is people have concerns. And I'm just saying these are legitimate concerns. You mentioned the courts. I've acknowledged the process has worked its way to a conclusion. I've got something like 59 court cases. Now, many of these, as Mr. Troop has talked about, some were not decided on the facts. They're just decided and dismissed based on standing, which is, again, that's our process. That's a legitimate decision by a court, but it's not very satisfying for people who have some facts that want to be considered by a court. Or Mr. Bernal, the same thing in Nevada. So to deny the reality that we have a problem, a very serious problem, that's not the main. The main thing is we have to acknowledge that problem and we have to work together to fix it, to restore the confidence. So let me just see if I can wake up Mr. Ryan and Mr. Palmer, make sure they're there. Ask a question of each of you, and then I'll give all of you the opportunity to kind of make a relatively brief. I mean, this is actually a long hearing for us. I know the Judiciary Committee sometimes goes on long, but this is a long hearing for our committee. And I really do appreciate the involvement of as many members who took this thing seriously. But Mr. Ryan, are you there?
Yes, sir. I am. Thank you, Senator.
Okay. Sorry about that. I hope you had lunch or something in the interim. Representative Ryan, in our conversations, you were talking about, as Mr. Bernal talked about, your inability to get access to certain things that, I would hope Director Krebs would agree should be transparent, and that those of you having questions about or even challenging results should have access to in order to mount an effective challenge. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, Senator. As a former chair of an audit committee of publicly traded companies and currently the chair of the audit committee, the Public School Employee Retirement System, the control environment is a critical component of it. Mr. Krebs is referring to, as an example, the security systems, and I don't dispute his comments on that at all. And I applaud the great work that's been done at CISA. But until the entire control environment, that's the tone at the top, has been properly evaluated and documented to where you can have a Six Sigma or lean systems approach that allows you to be able to have this transparent, auditable result, it violates one of the basic principles of any systems of internal controls. One of the things that we tried to deal with the Sarbanes-Oxley bill that I think was done effectively was this concept of control deficiencies, significant deficiencies, and material weaknesses. The absence of the ability to provide a timely audit of that information is problematic. And I would just like to just make this comment. I spent a lifetime as a reserve officer, and so I was also on active duty, either in Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti, Operation Iraqi Freedom. I helped supervise some of the elections results in Iraq in 2005 after I was called out of retirement. And I would pray that all those sacrifices made by the millions upon millions of people who served in our military to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against enemies, foreign and domestic, would be upheld as well on our shores, so that we can ensure the same type of election integrity that we're asking for with transparent, fair, and accurate results can be assured within the United States. We know 44 of the states apparently went off without a hitch. So we have 6 states that we're dealing with. That's a pretty good track record. But unfortunately, when you consider the fact that the 4 of the states were that razor thin margin close, the results of the election could have been in question. I concur, Senator, that most of the results have already been looked at from a challenge from a legal perspective. So it's probably a moot point for the current election, but I pray that the Senate will take up this battle standard and say we need to really reaffirm to make sure that the people have the faith and confidence in our election systems. I try to live by a triangle of faith. The faith is to believe is to have faith, and to have faith is to have trust. Whenever that trust triangle is broken, we will have difficulties and discord will follow. And I pray to God that every person listening to this testimony hears your words and says, let's have a peaceful resolution of all of these concerns that we have so we can get on with business as usual.
Well, thank you, Representative Ryan, and thank you for your service. And we'll come back to you for your closing comment. Mr. Palmer, in our discussion prior to this hearing, and again, I appreciate your service and in your membership of the commission, you talked about some things that troubled you with this election. Can you just kind of review those with the committee?
Well, a few of the things that I was concerned about, I think that raised the emotions from the political campaigns. Some of it was the treatment of poll watchers. I believe transparency is a very important thing. And one of the concerns I had was that people need to be treated with respect. I understand as an election administrator that often we are doing our job and we don't believe anybody needs to be watching the process. But some of the reports, it gets back to sort of this, the way we treat each other in this country, you know, and if a poll watcher is observing the process, they have a right to be there. They observe the process. They need to be respectful of the election official. There were some significant reports that process was, interfered with, and people were treated very poorly. And it's not the first time. I worked at the Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division, and one of the things that I saw often was based on party or race. You know, citizens treat each other poorly, and even in the context of elections. And so I think that we need to make a commitment of respect toward each other and to each political campaign. I think that was the major issue. I think that hearing a lot of the reports about the inaccuracy of the voter rolls, I've been talking about this for a long time. It's because there's just not the focus or the resources provided at the state or local level, in my opinion, to maintain the accuracy of the voter rolls. I think that a lot can be done in a nonpartisan way, in a very smart way with technology. Election officials don't often have the latest technology, and so upgrades to voter registration systems and to resources of data can help them clean and make sure their rolls are as accurate as can be. And frankly, I just think that this has become somewhat of a partisan issue, and therefore any attempt to maintain the accuracy of the rolls can be seen as a negative. This is what happens, is that if you have highly inaccurate rolls, then there's perception of fraud. Sometimes there's actual fraud. We actually see that. And it may not change an election except in a close race, but our job as administrators to make sure that there is no fraud and mitigate and minimize any irregularities. That's the goal. Only with technology and resources and a commitment to doing it will we see those instances decrease. And that's I believe technology and resources are some bipartisan ways to decrease that, sir.
If you could also, because your commission does act to certify some of these voting machines, not all of them, but in some states you do. Can you just quickly, and I mean quickly, go through kind of what that certification process is? And I think that was one of the issues you did see is, somebody trying to get back into those machines inside that certification process.
Well, we have a certification process for voting systems. One of the vulnerabilities that we have, and I believe CISA would agree, is that the non-voting systems that are tied to the internet, they perform important functions like voter registration, electronic poll books. There is no standards or testing. And what's one of the things that we're trying to do at the EAC with adequate funding we could do, but it's a big gap in our defenses, and it's one that we may not have been burned this time, but it is a vulnerability, and we need to take care of it.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, now we'll move to closing statements here, and we'll go in reverse order. So again, former Director Krebs, again, I appreciate your service to the country. I appreciate what you accomplished. I mean, as you know, I've acknowledged that repeatedly. I mean, I think the fact that we've gone from 82 to 95% paper backup, that's all great stuff. And I certainly appreciate you coming here and testifying today. So I'll let you, with any closing comments, go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson. I'm going to keep this short because I think this is a historic hearing for me. This may be the longest hearing that I've had in this chamber. So I will try to wrap this one up quickly. First is thank you to you for your ongoing and constant support of CISA. You were key in getting us across the finish line in the Senate and ultimately in November of 2018. So thank you for your leadership there, supporting other key initiatives for the agency, including the administrative subpoena bill. So thank you for that. Just a quick comment to the team at CISA, if they're watching, it was an honor to lead. Thank you for that opportunity to lead you. You've got a great future ahead of you. Keep at it. And then lastly, thank you to the other witnesses for showing up today, and thank you for what they do. But again, thank you to your leadership here, and good luck.
Although maybe based on the retention issue, you might encourage him to stay a little bit longer, but I'll do that. Mr. Bunnell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We cannot ignore voter fraud away. We can't just wish it away. Unfortunately, that's what the media these past weeks has been trying to do. In the most biased reporting I think I've ever seen, where even in headlines, they try to claim that the evidence I've seen with my own eyes is somehow not there. We can't wish it away. It is just simply right now a gaslighting attempt on America. This is real. This happened. We have to address it. We cannot intimidate the problem away. Rightfully, much testimony today has talked about why it's so important that government officials, election officials, not be intimidated. But myself, the lawyers on my team, volunteers, whistleblowers, there's a number of people who have stood up for this fraud that have faced similar death threats, similar intimidation, similar harassment. I don't pay it a lot of attention because no one is ever going to intimidate me away from pursuing the truth, pursuing the law, representing my client. But we need to make sure that other groups that are out there that are encouraging the intimidation of lawyers, even from threatening to go after their bar cards on one side, going after their clients, or going after their safety or their lives, that cannot stand either. We cannot stonewall it away. I talked briefly about some stonewalling attempts. One other that we ran across in Nevada is that we had Postal Service employees that we knew of that were directly told to deliver ballots to undeliverable addresses. That is what resulted in ballots being littered all across apartment mailrooms and trash cans everywhere. And they were told in many instances to deliver ballots to undeliverable addresses. And the United States Postal Service, they obstructed our ability to get that evidence in our case. We lost one of our 15 depositions because the United States Postal Service actually obstructed that. It raises the question with all this stonewalling that we encountered. What do you have to hide? And I think we know in this case what there is to hide. I said in my opening statement that government by consent of the governed is hard to win and easy to lose. That's why it's so important that we take this so incredibly seriously. Senator Hawley told a very important story about his constituents, and I ask all senators to think about their constituents, to think about how you're supposed to tell your constituents to turn out to vote if they don't know that it's their vote that's going to matter, that they don't know that their vote is going to be canceled out by the fraud of somebody else. Their vote's going to be diluted by these irregularities. We can't pretend that this problem didn't happen. It did. This is the United States of America. We don't run from that. We fix it. We have to use every arrow in our quiver to fix it because it did happen. And it's now on all of us to make sure that we fix it. I really appreciate the committee's time and the chairman's time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bernal. Representative Ryan.
Senator, thank you very much for candidly your courage in having this hearing. If I could just conclude with these comments. Our nation is at a crossroads. No matter what happens with any of the work that is being done relative to looking at this, since probably about the year 2000, and apparently even went back as far as 1787, although I wasn't there for that particular meeting, shortly thereafter, but not that one. The consent of the governed will determine whether or not they believe in the results of any election. It has gotten significantly worse. It's one of the reasons I ran for office and was elected in 2016, obviously later in my life. We have to examine the processes from start to finish. CISA has done a phenomenal job in so many different respects, and under the concerns relative to COVID-19, I actually recommend using the CISA standards. And for all the poll watchers, all the poll workers, the directors of election, God bless them for the great work that they've done. By the same token, there's a point in time now where we as a nation have to sit back and say, we have to solve these problems. We have to take a look at the entire process from start to finish and the ability of people to interfere with those election results. The ability of the person to be able to change the system of control so that we can no longer rely on it. I've heard some of the comments today, and I go back to what I heard in 2007 and 2008 when I was a practicing CPA, keeping companies out of bankruptcy, and Meredith Whitney was bringing up the concerns she had about the strength and stability of the banking industry, and she was vilified. Michael Lewis, when he wrote The Big Short, was vilified. The assumption was that no documentation loans were not dangerous. Ignore that concern that both of them had, nothing to be concerned about. Shortly thereafter, there was a triggering event and the housing bubble burst. And the United States was thrust into one of the worst issues that we've had to deal with financially in a long time. Many states are still recovering. I would tell you we are at that seminal moment today relative to the sanctity of our elections that have probably been building since 1787. But now is the time for all of us to sit back and say we need to not vilify one another. And Senator, I applaud you for your willingness to get to an open, transparent basis here. But we need to sit down and do these types of hearings. As much as the Band-Aid being pulled off may be painful, we need to expose these concerns so that people, the 150 million people who voted, can once again feel with confidence that the election process works and their vote mattered. Senator, thank you for your time and for the great work of your entire staff.
Well, thank you, Representative Ryan, for your testimony and your service to this country. Mr. Troupas.
Senator, thank you very much. I want to say that right off the bat that I'm honored to represent the president. I was honored to get the call, but I'm not naive. One of the reasons I was called is because virtually every major law firm in this country and in this city refused to represent the president, not because of the lack of merit of his claims. We've certainly demonstrated there's merit, but because of the cancel culture, because of the environment that has been created by the left that has intimidated lawyers. So they can't be here. They're not here because from the giant law firms, precisely because they were ordered by their management committees and others that you cannot take those cases. And the reason you cannot take those cases is because our clients or the Democrat Party or the incoming administration will remember that and they will hold it against you. That's a sad state of affairs. As a former judge, I was so incensed by that I took the representation. That was the ultimate reason I took that representation. And I've heard a lot today about what went on afterwards, as if these latest threats are coming from the right. Remember why and how this started after the election. We need to have faith in our court system. We have to acknowledge that the court system has been deeply intimidated by the left, just as the lawyers have been intimidated. And that is a sad, sad state of affairs. And I so much appreciate, Senator, that you're holding these hearings, because otherwise, as we're finding out all over the country, these items just disappear. Number two, I wanted to say, as I've said throughout my testimony, that one of the reasons people are doubting the election is because the other side here, the Biden campaign's primary defense is don't hear the evidence. Don't let them litigate. Don't have a court rule on the substance. Let's be honest, that's what's going on. And so that's why the public doesn't trust this outcome. It's not about the president. It's about what the other side is doing to intimidate and force people not to listen, not to take the evidence. I've heard lots of fancy words here today, but if you give transparency, if you let the issues come out, and I've represented Republicans and I've represented Democrats, and at the end of the day, lawyers do their job when it is in the open and we are able to present the evidence. And I so appreciate the fact that you, a non-lawyer, is taking on this task here. But finally, and I have to say this, we had 4,000 people volunteer from everywhere in the country to come to Wisconsin to participate in the process. We had over 2,500 volunteers over a 10-day period take their own time, their own money, come from all over the country. And they came and they attended the recount and they participated. And I said to the recount on the floor, the Democrats and the Republicans, I said, if you are losing your faith in the greatness of this republic, look at this recount. Look at the number of people from the Trump campaign and from the Biden campaign that would give of their time and effort to be here, in that case in Madison, Wisconsin. It was humbling, truly humbling for me and everyone on our legal team and everyone who was there. We have a great system and people want to participate. Let's make it transparent. And again, I can't thank those volunteers enough. They're the ones who make this democracy work.
Thank you, Mr. Troopers. And I noticed Mr. Banal shaking his head when you were talking about the fact that lawyers from large law firms were more than discouraged. They were actually prevented from representing the president, which is kind of a sad state of affairs. I'll also say, storefronts in big cities didn't board up their windows in anticipation of a Vice President Biden victory. Commissioner Palmer.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I will make a few comments. The EAC is looking at holding a series of hearings and to issue a report on some nonpartisan recommendations. There's going to be a lot of policy disputes around the country in state legislatures, and that can be debated back and forth about what's the best policies on certain areas. But we as the election administration community want to do better. We understand that oftentimes there are flaws in the way we administer elections. It happens in every election. We could always do better. The way we respond in the election administration community, just like the military, is more education and more training and more resources when available. And that is really the recipe, I believe, moving forward, is if you want to improve the performance of election officials and their election workers within an office and our poll workers, it will take a commitment of time, resources, and training to do so. And the EAC is prepared to do that free to localities if with appropriate funding. I think that is really my solution, thinking back to my military days. Whenever there was an issue, more education and more funding, more training.
Thank you, Commissioner Palmer. Judge Starr, you are leadoff hitter. Now you're batting cleanup here. So thank you for hanging in there. You have some closing comments.
I think the bottom of the order, Mr. Chairman, but thank you. Thank you for your leadership. In a real sense, today's hearing has been a tribute to the Constitution. I love Senator Carper's comments about December 7, 1787, and the idea to form a more perfect union. And this hearing has been in that spirit. I'm also reminded of one of President Lyndon Johnson's favorite quotes from the prophet Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." And I think this has been a time of reasoning together and listening and the great traditions of the United States Senate. So let me close with words that I heard with my own ears from United States Senator Alan Simpson, now the tender age of 89 in retirement. And when he was addressing in his valedictory at the Kennedy Institute of Politics, which he headed for 2 years, he told the audience, and it was in very hushed tones, because whatever your politics were, Alan Simpson was a great man and recognized to be that. And he closed with these words: "In politics, if you don't have integrity, you don't have anything." And what this hearing is trying to do is to how can we, in fact, promote not just confidence in government, but how can we, in fact, promote the integrity and honesty, which is at the bedrock of the kind of government in whom we can trust. So thank you for the honor of appearing before the committee.
Well, thank you, Judge Starr, for your participation, for your service to this country. I do want to make a comment. We spoke to, and we were very appreciative of the fact that the Dominion Systems, Edison Research, AP, a number of people we spoke to prior to this hearing. Now, they didn't all participate, but we will leave the record open, and I encourage everybody we spoke to and people that we didn't. If you want to input information into this record, you've got a couple weeks to do it, and I encourage it. And our staff will look at that, and we will vet it. We'll call you. We'll ask questions. This hearing is not dangerous. What would be dangerous is not discussing this openly and frankly with transparency. This is a problem that we have to acknowledge and recognize and solve together. And we're only going to do that with information. So I'm soliciting information. Okay, this is only part of the process. There was oversight before this hearing. There needs to be oversight after this in the next Congress. Hopefully I can work with Senator Carper, who I think we all recognize has done a pretty good job of outreach here and some pretty bipartisan words here. So I'm hoping that's how we can move forward. Because I truly think as Americans we share the same goal. We all want a safe, prosperous, secure country, state, community. That's what we want. We want to be able to raise our children in safety and freedom. And the way it works in this country is through participation in the democratic process. So I think everybody in this panel wants to make sure that we have good participation. We encourage citizens to participate. We also want every legitimate vote to count. But we should be every bit in favor of making sure that every vote is legitimate. And that's what this is all about. If we can put the controls in place and actually act on them, it's great having paper ballots, but you have to have access to look at it to give yourself confidence in the current election and moving forward that, okay, this all worked out. Wisconsin's recount, totally honest, our count was almost 100% accurate. Other issues, but again, I think Wisconsin, we got a pretty good level of confidence that we run our elections right now. I'll just give another shout out to Jeanette Mertens. My county clerk, my clerk of courts down of Oshkosh, and I'm sure the vast majority are just like Jeanette. We're in really good hands. So to conclude, this is my last hearing. It has been an honor and privilege to chair this committee. Hearing's adjourned.